They thought it was just an ordinary class picture. For more than 100 years, that's all anyone noticed when they looked at the old black and white photo from the Blackwood School for Wayward Children. A group of children sitting in neat rows, dressed in formal clothes, their teacher standing tall behind them. Nothing about the image seemed out of place. Just another quiet moment from the past. But in 2024, that perception changed completely. It started with Dr. Aris Thorne, a digital archivist at the Historical Preservation Institute in Boston. His job was usually pretty straightforward, scanning old documents and photographs, making sure they were saved and searchable in digital form. Birth records, dusty letters, family albums. It was the kind of work that rarely offered surprises. That all changed one Tuesday morning in October. A new collection had just arrived, donated from the long-closed Blackwood School for Wayward Children. The school had been shut down in 1947 after nearly 70 years of operation. The boxes delivered to the Institute were filled with old-school records, letters, and fragile glass plate negatives. Everything had been locked away in storage for decades. Aris opened the first box with care. Inside, wrapped in aged cloth, were glass negatives, delicate and dusty but intact. He began scanning them one by one. The first image was of the school building itself, a large 3-story brick structure with narrow windows and a heavy wooden front door. The second image showed the dining hall, bare walls, long wooden tables, no decorations. The third image was the class photo from 1906. There were 23 children in the picture. The boys wore jackets and caps. The girls had high-collared dresses. All of them sat still in 3 tidy rows. Standing behind them was their teacher, Miss Evelyn Reed. Aris placed the glass negative on his high-resolution scanner and set it to capture every detail. 12,000 dots per inch. As the image processed, he leaned in to examine it on his screen. The level of detail was incredible. You could see individual threads in the children's clothing, even count the buttons on their jackets. But what really caught his eye was Miss Reed. She stood perfectly still, hands clasped in front of her. Her hair was tightly pulled back into a bun, her expression serious, typical for teachers of that era. But something about her face didn't sit right. Aris zoomed in. Then he zoomed in further. It was her eyes. Her pupils weren't dilated, as you'd expect in a dimly lit room. They were tiny, sharp pinpoints in the middle of her pale irises. It didn't make sense. Indoor photos from that period were taken in low light. Pupils should have been wide open to let in as much light as possible. Instead, hers looked unnaturally constricted. Aris checked everything, his scanner settings, the glass negative itself, even the lighting. Nothing was wrong, no errors, no damage. The photo was authentic. The detail was real, but what he was seeing didn't add up. He tried to move on with other work, but his mind kept circling back to that photo. There had to be an explanation. At first, he wondered if it was just an old photography quirk. Maybe the chemicals used in development had done something strange. But after digging deeper into historical photography methods, he became more certain. This wasn't a mistake. It was something else. Next, he turned to researching the school itself. The Institute had limited records, but enough to form a picture. Blackwood opened in 1878 as a private boarding school for what they called wayward children, usually from wealthy families. These were kids their parents wanted out of the public eye, often labeled difficult or disobedient. Families paid large sums for their children to be reformed at Blackwood. But Aris noticed something unusual. The school had a disturbingly high death rate. In 1905 alone, 7 students died. The official causes were always illnesses, things like influenza, scarlet fever, or pneumonia, common enough back then. But 7 deaths in 1 year at a school with fewer than 50 students, that stood out. He went back to the class photo from 1906 and started matching names. 3 of the children in that photo died within the next 2 years, all of them, according to records, from fevers. Curious, Aris dug deeper into the box of negatives and found another photo, taken the same day. This one showed the classroom from a wider angle. The same children were at their desks. Miss Reed stood near the blackboard, which was filled with multiplication tables. In the back of the room, almost hidden in the shadows, was a tall glass cabinet. He zoomed in and enhanced that part of the photo. Inside the cabinet were rows of bottles and vials. Most of the labels were too blurred to read, but one label on a larger bottle sitting on the middle shelf was just clear enough to make out. It said scopolamine. Can you imagine finding that? But that was just the beginning. The word on that bottle sent Aris down a completely new path. Scopolamine. It was a drug made from nightshade plants, once used by doctors in the early 20th century as an anesthetic during surgeries. But it wasn't just for pain relief. In smaller doses, it had a very different effect. It acted like a truth serum. Law enforcement even used it in interrogations. And in higher doses, it became something else entirely, a powerful sedative that could suppress breathing to the point of death. Here's the disturbing part. An overdose of scopolamine looked exactly like a high fever. Flushed skin, a racing pulse, shallow breathing, confusion, even hallucinations. And when the body finally gave out, it was usually blamed on an illness like pneumonia or the flu. Aris realized that any doctor unfamiliar with the drug back then would have no reason to suspect foul play. On paper, it would all look natural. But he wasn't ready to jump to conclusions. He needed more than a theory. He needed evidence. So he started combing through the school's financial records box by box. Most of what he found was expected: receipts for food, coal for heating, supplies for student uniforms. Then, buried deep in one of the ledgers, he found it. Purchase orders from a company called Whitman Pharmaceutical, repeated deliveries of medical supplies, and among them, regular, large shipments of scopolamine. The amounts were shocking. Blackwood School was ordering enough to sedate a small hospital. And the deliveries didn't come once or twice. They were monthly, sometimes more often. Every one of those orders was signed by the same person, Miss Evelyn Reed. She was in full control of the school's medical cabinet. Aris began mapping everything out. He made a calendar and started placing each scopolamine delivery on it, and then he added the dates of the recorded student deaths. The result was undeniable. Almost every death happened just days after a new shipment arrived. Miss Reed would receive the drug, and within a week, children would begin to die. But still, Aris knew this wasn't enough. The timeline was damning, but he needed something more direct, something personal. That's when he found it. At the very bottom of the final box was a worn, leather-bound journal. Inside the front cover, a name was written in careful script: Thomas Garrett, groundskeeper. Garrett had worked at Blackwood from 1898 to 1907. His journal was filled with daily notes about the weather, tending the gardens, and repairing things around the school. But scattered throughout were entries that hinted at something much darker. At first, the comments were mild but unsettling. One entry from March 1905 read, "The new teacher, Miss Reed, has strange methods. She gives the children her special medicine when they misbehave. They become quiet as dolls afterward. Too quiet, if you ask me. Then things became more specific. In September, he wrote, young William would not stop crying yesterday. Miss Reed gave him a dose of her medicine. He hasn't woken up. They say it's fever, but I saw her hand him that bottle." As the months passed, the entries grew more urgent and more afraid. October 19th, 1905. I watched from the window as Miss Reed prepared her medicine. She measures it carefully, but I think she uses too much. The children stumble and fall asleep at their desks. Some don't wake up for hours. I fear some may never wake up at all. Then came the entry that pulled everything together, dated January 15th, 1906, the same day the class photograph was taken. Garrett wrote, "The photographer came today to take the class portrait. The children were restless and wouldn't sit still. Miss Reed grew angry. I saw her mix a strong batch of her medicine and give it to each child. She said it would help them stay calm for the picture." The entry went on. Within minutes, they all grew quiet. Their eyes turned glassy. Some slumped in their chairs. Miss Reed moved them into place like dolls. She propped up the ones who couldn't sit on their own. Little Sarah in the front row was completely unconscious, but Miss Reed positioned her head so it looked like she was just looking down. Can you picture that? The photographer took the shot while Miss Reed stood behind them smiling. And then came the final line of that entry, the most haunting of all. After he left, 3 of the children wouldn't wake up. Miss Reed sent them to the infirmary. She told me it was a sudden fever, but I know the truth. She gave them too much of her medicine. I pray they survive. But I have seen this before. It's amazing how one old photo, something no one looked at twice, could hold the key to a mystery buried for over a century. But the story wasn't over yet. Not even close. They almost never do. Aris stared at the final journal entry, frozen. The photograph on his screen no longer looked like a class portrait. It was a crime scene. Those children hadn't been posing. They had been sedated, some likely near death, arranged by their teacher for the perfect picture. Miss Evelyn Reed had drugged an entire classroom. Looking again at their faces, Aris saw the truth. The blank expressions weren't seriousness, but sedation. Their stiff posture wasn't discipline. They could barely sit upright. Some were unconscious, positioned to appear normal. Even Miss Reed's tiny pupils made sense now. She was likely using the same drug, scopolamine, to stay calm and detached while she committed her crimes. Thomas Garrett's journal told what happened next. 2 days after the photo, young Sarah Mills died. Scarlet fever, the record said. A week later, James Patterson died of influenza. 10 days after that, Margaret Brown passed from brain fever. Garrett wrote, "I know what she is doing, but who would believe me? She is educated. I am just a gardener." His entries grew more frantic. He wrote that she had enough poison to kill every child in the school. Then on March 10th, his note stopped. 2 days later, Garrett was dead. Heart attack, the record said. He was 42, healthy, and had no history of illness. Miss Reed continued teaching for 2 more years. 11 more children died before she left in 1908. After she was gone, the deaths stopped. Later, Aris found she'd moved to Chicago and worked at 2 other schools, both with spikes in unexplained child deaths. She died in 1921 of natural causes, never questioned, never charged. The evidence was overwhelming. At least 37 children had died under her care, perhaps more. The photo now looked completely different to Aris. What once seemed like a strict Victorian portrait was proof of horror. Miss Reed's faint smile wasn't pride, it was control. Her hand on a student's shoulder wasn't gentle, it was possessive. The discovery changed everything. Aris published his findings, determined the world should know. The story spread fast, across academic circles, into newspapers, then online. The once forgotten photograph became infamous. People stared at those faces, realizing some of them were living their final moments. The image now hangs in a museum of historical crimes, a plaque beneath it telling the story of Miss Reed and her victims. Visitors stand silently before it, seeing what no one saw for more than a century. The photo proves that truth can survive, waiting for the right eyes and the right moment. Some ask, why does it matter now? The answer is simple. Those children mattered. They weren't names on paper, they were lives, deserving remembrance. Aris still works as an archivist, scanning each new photo with care, knowing any image might hold buried secrets.